I'm Whitney Weiss,
I'm Cade Chatema.
I'm Michael Giroux.
I'm Kyle Apple.
and this is our comprehensive analysis of compensation and performance in the National Basketball Association. So first we have prepared a table of contents for your convenience. And here's our executive summary. We're going to be introducing our project in an overview. We're going to be discussing our methodology. We're going to be explaining our data model, and then we're going to draw a few conclusions. So a little bit of background, over $3.5 billion in salaries were given out to National Basketball Association players in the 2018-2019 season alone. And commonly in professional sports, higher pay is usually associated with higher performance among players and teams. However, the highest paid players sometimes don't even perform better than other players. So in order to determine if a correlation exists between payroll and player and team performance, we want to learn a couple of things. The correlation between a player's salary and their performance based on a few key indicators, and whether overall team payroll affects team performance. Some of the motivation for our project is we're all interested in the NBA and like to follow various teams, and also are interested in what goes on behind the scenes and the stats. A little bit of context, in the past few years, players have been receiving higher and higher salaries, and also the NBA is in the public eye right now.
NBA teams would like to get the best performance out of the players that they pay the most money. We will use data such as player statistics, team performance, and team payroll and player salaries in order to get insights into the following questions. Do teams with a higher payroll frequently have a higher team winning percentage? And do players with better key performance indicators receive a larger player salary? To test our first business question about the relationship between team payroll and team performance, we have a null hypothesis that there is no relationship between the two variables, and an alternative hypothesis that there is a significant relationship between the two variables. For our second business question about the relationship between individual pay and key performance indicators, we will test a null hypothesis that there is no relationship and an alternative hypothesis that there is a statistically significant one. We have made multiple assumptions to conduct our hypothesis testing. First of all, we have assumed that all teams have the same strength of schedule. Second, we have assumed that performance metrics are considered as is and are not adjusted to reflect externalities. Thirdly, we have assumed that statistical performance and pay level are positively correlated. And for our last three assumptions, we have assumed that our residuals are independent, normally distributed, and homoscedastic. For our business question number 1 data set, we took salary numbers from Data World, winning percentages from Basketball Reference. We had 4 variables: team, annual salary, year, and win percentage, 285 team records, and we leveraged a pivot table in order to not have to clean our data.
So for the second data set for the second business question, unlike Cade said on the first one, this one did actually need some data cleaning. The data was pulled from NBA Advanced Statistics and had a little under 30 variables in all the columns and a little under 5,000 different records for all the different players. As I mentioned, there was a little bit of data cleaning that we did need to do. First, we needed to remove some specific immaterial variables that didn't add a lot of value to the specific regression that we were going to run. Specifically some ratios like rebounds divided by turnovers, assists divided by turnovers, and then some different things that were skewed just based on the amount of games played, minutes, points per game, and so on. Additionally, the second main data cleaning thing that we had to do with this one is that there was a lot of blanks for different players who had specific stats that they played in, but they didn't have any specific salaries. Initially, we were kind of confused on why this would be, but after doing a little bit of research, we were able to attribute this primarily to the current G League system, which allows NBA teams to have 2 NBA assignees, 3 flex assignees, and 2 two-way players. And then essentially with this, the players are able to record statistics while the G League team pays for the salary, which in turn created the blanks in our specific data set. And then to deal with these blank fields, we used a nested VLOOKUP formula with an if-error function to identify all the different blank fields and then filter them out. So accordingly, here was our final data set. We had 19 variables and then almost 4,000 different records. And then for your convenience, we provided a specific code log with all the different variables that we had in our original data sets and what they correlate to with the specific NBA statistic. So next I'm going to transition into the specific methodology that we use for our different data models. We ran primarily 3 different models: a simple and multivariable linear regression to test our 2 different null hypotheses, And then we also ran a multi-collinearity model because of the multiple linear regression model that we ran, just due to the fact that we wanted to make sure that there wasn't any skew and any dependence on all the different independent variables. And Kyle will touch on the results of that later. And then while we did run those 3 models, we did choose not to run 2 specific models, the F-test and the T-test model. We chose not to do the F-test model primarily because the population of all the data in NBA statistics lacks a normal distribution with a little bit of skew to the left. And then in turn, we didn't think variances would be the best estimate for proving our specific regression model. And then additionally, we also chose not to do the t-test model for specific non-NBA statistical reasons. Primarily, the population of all NBA data is going to be limited in its tracking capabilities prior to stats not being tracked prior to the shot clock era. And then also with some recent developments like different generational skew with how basketball is played now compared to how it was 60 years ago. And then the addition of the salary cap, the soft cap has inflated over the years in the NBA, which additionally would cause some skew in the data as well. And next, Kyle will introduce our specific data model.
So to answer our first business question about the correlation between team winning percentage and team payroll, we used a simple linear regression model, and we started with a scatter plot. As you can see from the scatter plot, our R-squared value of correlation is 0.0192, which only explains about 2% of the variance between team payroll and win percentage. So to understand if this 2% variation was statistically significant, we continued with full linear regression, and we found with a p-value of 0.019, while the correlation is only 2%, it is statistically significant. So our hypothesis, as we have earlier stated, while it's not strongly correlated, it is statistically significant, which is an interesting find. Because this relationship is not strongly correlated, we did a little outside research, and we found research by John Vrooman, who's a professor at Idaho State University, that explains why this relationship could possibly be statistically significant, despite the fact that it is not strongly correlated. And his research finds that in different markets, large markets like New York City or Los Angeles versus small markets like Milwaukee, large market teams have a systemic advantage over small market teams in that they are always able to recruit better players. Their players nearly always perform better, and they will almost always outpay players based on that total payroll figure. So that explains why, while it's statistically significant that players who are paid, or that teams that have more money do have a higher win percentage, that explains why that correlation is only at 2%. For our business question on the relationship between pay and performance at an individual level, we decided to look at 16 variables, all taken from the NBA Advanced Statistics website. So we found that with all 16 variables in a multi-variable regression, the R-squared correlation is approximately 40%. So in other words, 40% variation in player salary is directly attributable to how they perform on the court. But looking at our p-values, a number of these p-values are not statistically significant and are not significantly affecting that R-squared correlation value. So we decided that we would remove each p-value that is not significant one at a time and rerun the regression. And ultimately, we came up with these residual plots and found that of those, only 9 of these key performance indicators have a statistically significant relationship on our R-squared correlation value. So after running this, we decided that we need to take this one step further. Despite the fact that our R-squared correlation value of 0.39 is within 0.5% of what it was with all 16 variables, we find that this is not surprising because the variables that we removed are not statistically significant and we're not having a major impact on that R-squared value. As you can see from our new residuals, they meet the requirements for being independent, normally distributed, and homoscedastic. So for our next step, we took these 9 variables and, as Michael mentioned earlier, ran a multi-collinearity test on these independent variables because we had a feeling that some of these variables were affecting one another, and that result in turn was affecting our correlation coefficient. So after removing all of our variables that were correlating with one another, we ended up having 4 variables that were both statistically significant and not multi-collineated. So rerunning the regression with these 4 significant and non-correlated values, we come up with a new R-squared correlation value of 0.317. In other words, approximately 32% of the variation in player salary is directly attributable to how players perform on the court. Now, this is significantly lower than our earlier R-squared value of 0.39, but we theorize that that makes sense because we removed variables from our regression that are statistically significant and had a major impact on that R-squared value. And once again, you can see our residual plots are once again independent, normally distributed, and homoscedastic. And now Whitney will tell you a little bit about our conclusions.
So for our first conclusion, we can determine that team payroll is not a strong estimator for overall team performance. While the relationship is statistically significant, it is weakly correlated, as you can see by the small r-squared value of 0.019. So therefore, we reject our null hypothesis and conclude that there is a statistically significant but very small positive correlation between overall team payroll and team performance.
And once again, for the relationship between individual pay and performance, we are also able to reject our null hypothesis, and once again conclude that there is a statistically significant relationship between individual pay and their performance on the basketball court. This is judged by the p-values that are all statistically significant for those 4 variables that I told you about earlier, and the fact that none of those 4 variables are multicollinear in any way, shape, or form. They all have a correlation amongst one another below the 0.7 threshold. So the final regression only had an r-squared value of 0.317, but this is significantly higher as that r-squared value in our first business question, which Whitney just told you about. So we are able to reject both of our null hypotheses and conclude that in both of our business questions there is a statistically significant relationship.
Thank you for listening to our comprehensive analysis of compensation and performance in the NBA.